Hello and welcome to the Next Generation Engagement Program, today's launch of our webinar series. We are really pleased to have so many of you joining us today, along with my fellow industry director, Kirsty O'Connell, and our esteemed panelists, Nick Thomas and Kylie Cochrane. Today's webinar is going to focus on COVID-19, the recent planning reforms, and the future of community engagement. So we're really excited that you're with us today. We encourage your colleagues to come along, send them a link, get that participation happening, and welcome to the first in what will be a series of webinars helping the infrastructure sector to access real-time, robust research to inform community engagement. Before we get going today, a couple of housekeeping items just to let everyone know that we are recording today's session. So if you ask questions or participate in that way, that will be recorded, and we really look forward to your participation. I'd also like to take a moment, as we're having a webinar across the nation, to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we are all meeting from. And here today, coming from Melbourne, where I live, the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and to acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of the land where we're broadcasting from. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Associate Professor Sara Bice, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Infrastructure in Society at the Crawford School of Public Policy, which is home to our flagship research program, the Next Generation Engagement Program. For those of you who might be new to NextGen, I'd like to just take a moment to start with a bit of information about it. So the Next Generation Engagement Program was launched in 2017, and we worked at that time with over 82 infrastructure sector organizations to define a research agenda for Australia's infrastructure sector. This is a world-first, industry-led effort to really understand the impacts of community engagement, social risk, and a social license to operate on infrastructure selection, planning, and delivery. We are a world-first program, and we are Australia's leading program in research in this area. So we really are excited today to share with you some of our research insights and to give you an update on the planning reforms that are happening around the country. And to tell you more about that, and also the partners that we work with, I'd like to hand over now to our industry director, Kirsty O'Connell. Kirsty.
Sara, thanks so much for the introduction, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have such a large and diverse group right across the country, private sector, public sector, and some extremely experienced people. So what a great way to start. I would like to acknowledge our partners. We are delighted to have the support of the Victorian Government's Major Transport Infrastructure Authority, the Queensland Government, Lend-Lease, Transurban, and the International Association for Public Participation. And I believe we have representatives from all of our major partners and many of our supporting partners in the audience today. So thank you so much for your support and your participation. We value it very much. Our network of partners is growing all the time. They contribute not only cash, but also intellectually to the program and provide in-kind support, and often work alongside us in doing the research as well. So it really is a very inclusive partnership and an integrated partnership that we have. And as Sara was saying, we're extremely proud of the fact that we have had 85 organisations contribute to our work to date. This year we are deepening community perspectives on our work as well. So we think that makes it quite a unique offering. We will actually have interviews, focus groups, and a series of national pulse surveys taking place to help really echo test what we're hearing from industry and to give a much fuller picture back in terms of those research areas that we're focused on. I'm very pleased to introduce today's panelists. We couldn't be more pleased than to have two of the leading thinkers in the infrastructure sector. Nick Thomas is a partner at Clayton Utz and one of Australia's leading environmental lawyers, and Kylie Cochrane is the global chair of the International Association for Public Participation. We will tell you more about both of those amazing speakers later in the program, but first, our moderator for today, Associate Professor Sara Bice, is the Research Director for the Next Generation Engagement Program and also for the Institute for Infrastructure in Society. She's one of the world's leading authors, thinkers, and researchers on social license and brings a wealth of experience in impact assessment. In fact, she was just recently named the Impact Assessment Professional of the Year globally by IAIA, which is the leading professional body in that space. So we're very pleased to have her. And over to you, Sara.
Thanks so much, Kirsty. I really appreciate the introduction. And we do welcome any and all of our partners who are with us today and the supporting organization representatives. Thanks so much for being here. Before we start, some of you may have attended some other webinars that we have presented at recently, and we just wanted to share for the benefit of those of you who haven't been in those forums, a little bit about what we know about community engagement in a pre-COVID-19 environment, some of the highlights from the research that we've been doing over the past 3 years. One of the main things that we do year on year is the State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey. And this survey asks participants who are all professionals working in or with the infrastructure sector about how their projects are tracking. Are things delayed? Are we delivering on time and on budget? And where we have delays, cancellations, mothballing, or delivery, but not as originally intended, what professionals in the sector see as being the most influential causes of those delays. And what we've learned year on year, and our 3rd year of survey results are to be released very soon, and there's some really interesting findings there. But what we find year on year is that stakeholder and community pressure is seen by professionals in the sector as either the leading or one of the top 2 leading causes, alongside regulatory and planning issues, of project delay, cancellation, mothballing, or delivery is not originally intended. And so the discussion today we think is particularly timely and important, because as we see these planning reforms come on board, that really reflects what people have been telling us about the causes of delay for projects. And so we really want to start to think about how this knowledge intersects with some of the planning changes that we're seeing happening. The other thing that we ask our respondents is to talk to us about when they think stakeholder and community pressures, these issues that cause delay, when they're most prevalent. And the majority of respondents tell us that they feel that those issues are most impactful during the planning and delivery stages. Right now, Australia has a $235 billion infrastructure pipeline. And in its 1919 infrastructure audit, Infrastructure Australia noted that we have a $600 billion infrastructure need to 2035. When we map what we know about the influence of stakeholder and community pressure on project delay with Australia's current infrastructure pipeline, we can see that the majority of projects are in the stages most vulnerable to those pressures. And so there's something really important happening here that we need to think about in terms of managing community engagement. Now that was pre-COVID, and as we move post-COVID, we've got even more to think about, and I wish we were post-COVID, talking to you from Melbourne. The COVID effect is that communities are under even greater pressure than ever before. And some of the things that we need to think about as a sector are how communities are going to live, work, and play very differently. We're going to spend a lot more time in our local neighborhoods, and there needs to be attention to local amenity. We also know that communities are under increased stress, and that the kinds of cumulative impacts that come with projects may be felt even more acutely. Over the past several months, since April, we in the Next Generation Engagement Program have been producing regular publications about some of these effects and providing as much detail as we can for how this may influence community engagement in Australia's infrastructure sector. And we really encourage you to have a look, because we've detailed how all of these issues listed here are being affected in the current environment and what that might mean for community engagement practice and the infrastructure sector more broadly. So that's a whole other webinar in itself, but today we are here to focus on planning reforms during COVID-19. And I'd like to turn back now to Kirsty O'Connell, who's going to spend about the next 20 to 25 minutes giving us a thorough review and summary of what reforms have occurred. And we will then go to our expert panelists for a discussion of how they see those reforms impacting infrastructure, selection planning, and delivery. Kirsty.
Thanks, Sarah. It's certainly been a fascinating time and probably an unprecedented level of changes at state and federal level over the last few months. Some of it temporary, some of it less temporary. So we'll try to give you a good overview of what's happening before we have Nick and Kylie provide their expert review of what's going on and what the implications might be. Let's start at a federal level because that's certainly going to affect everybody in the room. With the Australia-wide changes to the environmental protection and biodiversity conservation, I keep saying EPBC, and that's why, the EPBC Act. What we know is that we had a review this year by Professor Graham Samuel of that 20-year-old legislation, which makes the Commonwealth responsible for all matters that are deemed to be of national environmental importance, including the protection and recovery of flora and fauna and of World Heritage Areas. So Professor Samuel handed down his interim report in July and identified a number of serious shortcomings with the EPBC Act, in particular that it was poorly enforced, that it wasn't actually leading to an improvement in environmental outcomes, that it was ineffective and inefficient and added cost for proponents and business. So off the back of that report, he's recommended establishing a national environmental standard to which all states can comply. And that would be a legally enforceable, clear set of rules for decision making. That would then in turn allow the states to approve developments that would meet that strong set of environmental standards. Cabinet on the 24th of July has actually endorsed that move to a single touch environmental assessment for EPBC Act matters. And that will effectively devolve the decision making on EPBC Act matters to the states through a series of bilateral agreements, of course, provided that it passes through the Senate. So under that bilateral approval system, in practice, that would prevent a situation or could prevent a situation such as the one that we saw with the Traveston Dam in Queensland, where the state had actually endorsed a project. However, it was ultimately rejected by the federal Environment Minister, who was Peter Garrett at the time. Now, while the federal government has been fairly quick to take up many of the recommendations from Professor Samuel's review, they have already said that they won't be proceeding with his recommendation for an independent body to monitor compliance with the Act. And instead, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has instead focused on the need to hasten decision making. So he stated actually that at the end of 2019, EPBC Act approval decisions were taking 90 days on average, and today they take 40. So they've really targeted a reduction in those approval timeframes. He stated that his goal is to cut those approval timeframes by a further 25% to 30 days for major projects. Professor Samuel has suggested some interim or prototype standards that could be used ahead of the development of that national environmental standard that I mentioned. Moving on to New South Wales, we saw some quite early action from the New South Wales government with new ministerial orders put in place, which actually gave the Minister for Planning temporary power to approve new projects without consultation if he believed they were necessary to protect the health, safety and welfare of the public. Another standing order during that period was to extend the days for construction, giving projects some flexibility and the ability to really try to keep up with the slowdown created by social distancing on site. Some practical changes in terms of physical copies of documents no longer being required. And then, of course, more recent changes around the planning system acceleration program. So far, we've seen multiple tranches of projects approved, some 80 projects, in fact, approved, some of them quite controversial. So there are projects, for example, the metro station at Crow's Nest, which did have strong local community activism. the Inland Rail project, which had experienced some community activism. They were included in them. And there are some quite large projects such as the Gateway Motorway near Sydney Airport. So we're not talking just small projects. Some of them are extremely meaty. Now, to be considered for that accelerated pathway, they did have to be at an advanced stage. And the New South Wales government has been at pains to say that at no stage are they cutting out steps in the assessment process. They say that they have merely looked for projects to accelerate that were suitable to. There's currently a further 10 being considered, and that's across the board, including infrastructure and also other projects like coal mines and quarries. So that's New South Wales. It's key to note that Sara, key to note that those changes were to be applied for 6 months initially, with a possible extension of a further 6 months. Moving on to Queensland. Now, Queensland's planning legislation was amended in March to allow the minister to decide when an essential business could, for example, supermarkets and building sites, would be able to vary the conditions of their consent. So it was giving them some flexibility to be able to operate at the hours that they needed to, and really more of a practical change. Now, those provisions, in addition, allowing the opportunity for the minister to suspend or extend any of the statutory timeframes across the planning framework by declaring an emergency. Now, those provisions are a permanent part of the planning framework. The COVID-19 emergency was initially declared to be an applicable event under that new legislation from the 20th of March to the 20th of June, and that's now being extended to the 31st of October. Further changes have been proposed, with consultation on the new arrangements being concluded on the 7th of August. So that's currently now being considered. The further changes included changes to the development assessment rules, so permanently changing the method of giving notice in newspapers, changing the content of public notices, and requiring both adjoining owners and occupiers to be given notice of applications. And then changes to the minister's guidelines and rules, and that's the diagram that you can see on the slide. So the proposed changes there are aiming to streamline the ministerial and local government designation processes for critical infrastructure, and also to clarify the process for local government to make interim amendments to their local government infrastructure plan. So changes that really span the full gamut of quite small projects to significant projects. Moving on to Victoria. Victoria's early actions really focused on work site safety, more so than planning system changes, but they have introduced similar changes to those that we saw in the other states in more recent months. Now, of course, from the 8th of August, in response to that second wave of infections, Victoria did impose stage 4 restrictions. Under those new restrictions, the stage 4 restrictions, the number of workers on Victoria's big build construction project sites has been significantly reduced to support the safety protocols that were put in place by the Chief Health Officer. They're looking for ways to further manage the number of staff on site by assessing each project individually. And after those projects undergo an in-depth evaluation and safety analysis, they might be able to continue on the state's most critical projects. So the works that have been declared critical state construction projects include some of the largest transport projects, as well as urgent maintenance works on public housing and hospitals. The test was that it not only must be urgent work, but it also must be work that supported public health and safety. On the 24th of October, the government also made some practical changes to the Planning and Environment Act of 1987. So again, quite consistent, physical documents not being required, and some very practical changes to enable Planning Panels Victoria hearings to take place electronically so that people could join via Zoom and other means rather than being there in person. And finally, of course, in line with what many of the other states are doing, a significant investment and an effort to fast track projects to achieve economic stimulus. So that's happening under the Building Victoria Recovery Task Force, which was formed in April. The task force has actually already received some 295 applications and has done an initial assessment on those projects, and was as of last week, in the process of undertaking a more detailed review of applications from those 295 proponents. Effectively, they're looking for shovel-ready building and construction projects, and also planning and investment opportunities. So they've committed $180 million to that acceleration fund to support that work. Moving now to WA, and WA is a really interesting one. Their planning review was actually in train pre-COVID, so some of it has been certainly very well reviewed and has been the subject of extensive public consultation prior to arriving to the point that they are today. On the 24th of June, they passed the Planning and Development Amendment Act of 2020, and that actually supports the action plan for planning and reform, or for planning reform. Now, that's quite a detailed piece of work. It involves 3 goals and 19 reform initiatives to achieve those goals across the state. And of particular relevance is the initiative A3, if you do want to look at the detail of this particular piece of work. Initiative A3 is about land use and infrastructure planning and ensuring that that is coordinated. The actions under that include having a cabinet task force comprising ministers responsible for key infrastructure agencies, established with a mandate to address infrastructure barriers to urban consolidation and development. Research trials will also be undertaken, and data regarding forward infrastructure planning and staging by the state agencies will be collated and disseminated by WAPC to inform strategic planning. Of huge interest to people in this particular group is Initiative B2. The engagement and consultation processes should be consistent and effective across the state. Now, WA is the only state to have really targeted community consultation among its changes, so this is particularly interesting. Many of the community stakeholders that took part in the process with the WA government told them that they found the planning system quite difficult to understand and increasingly felt excluded from decision-making processes. So the problem was that the requirements and processes for community engagement and consultation were quite inconsistent between different planning authorities and tended to be reactive rather than proactive. So both industry and stakeholders have expressed some support for modernising community engagement practices and the regulatory requirements, and also making sure that they're more consistent and provide an opportunity for early engagement, which we've talked about quite a lot as part of our work as certainly being desirable. The early actions that they're taking on that are to have DPLH engage with stakeholders and the community by preparing a new engagement toolkit and implementing this through its own strategy and policy projects. And they've also initiated a pilot project to explore community attitudes on urban consolidation. A working group has been established to review and propose contemporary consultation and notification requirements for statutory planning proposals as well. So some really interesting work underway there, and something that we're going to be taking a keen interest in. Finally, if we take a look at the ACT did also have a parliamentary review in train pre-COVID. And what they were looking to understand was the level of engagement with the DA process. So that's now been accelerated in tandem with $35 million in fast-track local infrastructure spending. And we've spoken quite extensively about what we see as an important trend towards locally focused infrastructure and the value that communities will be placing on that local infrastructure. So that's an interesting initiative that they have underway. They're aiming to streamline that development assessment process, and the committee has actually reported back already with recommendations to improve the transparency, the proactive engagement and capacity building associated with that piece of work. So those recommendations are currently being considered by the ACT government, and a spokeswoman has already said that they might consider new regulations to expedite the development assessment processes, particularly for minor government works. So that's what we have at the moment, and it's certainly a moving feast. We've got some unprecedented challenges to deal with, and the states are moving quite quickly to provide the right kind of environment to stimulate the economy. So Sarah, back over to you.
Thanks so much, Kirsty. I really appreciate your giving us such a thorough review of what's happening both at the Commonwealth level with changes to the EPBC Act, which is a real tongue twister of an acronym, but very important changes happening there announced in July, as well as the changes that are happening in major states and territories, planning reforms that were occurring both before and now during COVID-19. We are so lucky to be joined today by two of Australia's leading experts in these areas, as Kirsty briefly introduced them before, Nick Thomas and Kylie Cochrane. And I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about our panelists before we turn to them to hear their perspectives on what's driving these reforms and what the implications are likely to be, both in our current pandemic environment and also post-pandemic. So Nick Thomas is a partner with Clayton Utz, and he's one of Australia's leading environmental lawyers. Nick's advised on some of the most significant infrastructure projects and corporate transactions in Australia. His clients include federal, state, and local government, as well as major corporations with a focus on infrastructure, property development, energy and resources, waste management, and the finance sectors. Nick has a really keen interest in social license to operate, and that's indeed how we came to be introduced in the first place. He's recognized in national and international legal directories, and he's really well known for his thorough understanding of practice areas and the practical solutions that he offers his clients. And so we'll be really keen to hear from Nick today about some of the practical solutions he might have in mind for these reforms and how they're going to affect Australia's infrastructure selection, planning, and delivery. Let me also take a moment to introduce in more detail our second expert panelist today, whom many of you may already know, Kylie Cochrane. Kylie is the global chair of IAP2. For those of you unfamiliar, that's the International Association for Public Participation, which is the world's leading professional body for community engagement practitioners, and we are really pleased to partner with them on the work that we do here. Kylie brings more than 30 years of experience working on contentious major infrastructure projects, so really if there's a controversy to be had around infrastructure, Kylie's probably there. She's been on WestConnex, the M4-M5 link, the Northern Sydney Freight Corridor, and the Sydney Desal project. And she's also one of Australia's most respected community engagement leaders. She's also the managing principal and global lead of communications and stakeholder engagement for the engineering and infrastructure advisory firm, Oricon. And she's led her team on a variety of nationally award-winning projects. So we are so pleased to welcome Nick Thomas and Kylie Cochrane. And if you'll all bear with me with the technology, I'm going to stop sharing these slides and bring up our panelists. Hello, Nick and Kylie. And for our audience members who may be unfamiliar with Zoom, if you are still only just seeing me, if you click in the upper right-hand corner, you can shift between speaker view and gallery view. And by shifting to gallery view, you will see all of our panelists. We also invite you to ask questions. So you will see at the bottom of your screen in your meeting controls bar, if you bring your mouse down to the bottom, there will be a little quote box that says Q&A, and if you click in there, we would really welcome your questions. But to kick us off, I'd like to start with Nick and to really give you a chance to give us your thoughts on the drivers of these changes that we've been discussing today and what you think they're going to mean in practice, their potential implications. So thank you, Nick.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now? Great. Well, thanks very much for the introduction. That's very kind of you. And thanks, Kirsty, too, for your introduction to the recent legislative and policy changes, which we're seeing around the country to deal with the pandemic that we're experiencing. I won't go over the changes again because I think Kirsty's covered them very well. But I will focus in my comments now on Commonwealth or EPBC Act rolls off the tongue a bit easier for me because I do it every day, and also the New South Wales changes. So let's start with the drivers for the changes. They're actually different for the Commonwealth and for the state. You might have picked that up in Kirsty's introduction, but I'll just elaborate a little more. So I think in New South Wales and the other states, really, the drivers are almost entirely an attempt to deal with the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And to my mind, they really have two main purposes. Firstly, I think they're designed to enable more timely delivery of goods and services which are needed during the pandemic. Take, for example, longer store operating hours and extended stock delivery times to cope with urgent demand. You might remember the toilet paper shortages, for example. And also streamlined approvals for emergency and other essential facilities, so medical clinics and the like. Under most planning laws, a COVID testing clinic would require all sorts of planning approvals just to get up and running. That process has been streamlined so that we can have pop-up clinics all over the country. And I think most people would agree that those are good outcomes. The second reason, though, I think, is to accelerate decision making and to enable assessment processes to continue during the pandemic so that public and private sector building projects, which, let's face it, are really the powerhouse for our economies, particularly during a crisis like this, can get planning decisions sooner and, if approved, can get underway sooner. Now, that's where there's a little more controversy, of course, in terms of the drivers for the state changes, and we'll talk a bit about that in the coming minutes. I want to turn now to the Commonwealth driver, and as Kirsty indicated, the changes at the Commonwealth level really have quite a different driver. They're a response to the interim report of the current review of the EPBC Act by the former ACCC Commissioner, Professor Graham Samuel. Now, Professor Samuel's review, as Kirsty mentioned, is mandated by the EPBC Act itself. The government has to review the Act every 10 years. This is the second review we've had under that requirement. The first review was a pretty comprehensive review, and you'll see, if you go back to the earlier report, a lot of similarities between the two reviews. Although I think that the outcome, if you like, the implementation of the previous review was pretty limited, I think the response to the Samuel review will be much more extensive, and we're already starting to see some of the consequences coming through now. So Professor Samuel's interim report back in June concluded that the EPBC Act is ineffective and recommended sweeping changes to it. That's actually consistent with many other reviews, both mandatory 10-year reviews and others of the EPBC Act over the years. And one of the most often cited shortcomings of the Act is that it duplicates state and territory approvals laws, thereby consuming significant time and money and other resources without providing any substantial environmental benefit. Now, the EPBC Act's always had a scheme for the Commonwealth Government to accredit states and territories to carry out assessments and approvals under the EPBC Act on the Commonwealth's behalf. That's not new. The existing Act allows that to be done via bilateral agreements between the Commonwealth and each state. The idea is that the states and territories would do the assessing and make decisions under the EPBC Act at the same time as they did so under their own legislation, but they'd need to follow some principles and processes set out in the bilateral agreements to ensure they still delivered on the objects of the EPBC Act. But the mechanism in the current legislation isn't all that sophisticated, and we're not necessarily seeing a great deal of follow through on the key principles, and I think that's where some of the shortcomings come through. Now, every state and territory currently has an assessment bilateral agreement with the Commonwealth and has done so for many years. So the Commonwealth rarely does its own assessments these days, apart from reviewing what the state and territory governments do at the point of making its own decision on approvals. But no one's had an approval bilateral agreement as yet, apart from one specifically for the Sydney Opera House, which lasted a few years. So we came very close to getting approval bilateral agreements in 2014, 2015, but the legislative amendments which the government proposed then to improve the bilateral scheme in the EPBC Act and the draft agreements themselves were actually rejected in the Senate when Clive Palmer had the balance of power. So that tells you a little bit about the politics there. The changes which are currently proposed by the federal government are essentially the same as those proposed in 2014, 2015. But I think given the different makeup of the Senate, they stand a better chance this time around. Meanwhile, the Samuel reports recommended a much more extensive and robust scheme for giving states and territories the power to grant approvals under the EPBC Act. And the foundation of that is going to be national environmental standards, which are currently being worked on. The question is, of course, if the Commonwealth Government does get approval bilateral agreements through as this interim measure, how long will it be before they seek to implement the more robust scheme, which Professor Samuel's actually recommending? So the Commonwealth changes are not really COVID related, although I think it's fair to say that the rush to establish approval bilateral agreements is partially driven by the desire to remove additional steps in the approval process to allow projects to get going sooner. So let's turn now to the practical impact of the changes. And again, I'll start with the state and then move to the Commonwealth. I think the main practical impacts of the New South Wales changes to date will be that projects can still be assessed and determined during the pandemic. There won't be if you like, a hiatus or a stop on the assessment processes. In some cases, with parts of that process streamlined, and then approved projects will have more flexible work hours. Other impacts, I think, will be much more specific, relating to particular projects as a result of specific ministerial orders that can be made under the new legislation. Now, of course, there might be some impacts on public participation in assessments, but I don't think the changes are really designed to limit public participation. I think the limits that we might be experiencing at the moment are really the result of restrictions on gathering and movement via the government's health orders, and of course, public reactions to the COVID pandemic. Just in my own experience, I noticed going to my local shopping centre 2 weeks ago, it was packed out, very busy, full of people. And then after a COVID scare, the following weekend, there was hardly anybody there. That's just people self-restricting their movement and their gathering. And I think we've got to understand that that's having a profound impact, quite apart from whatever laws or policies might be made. So I think that's going to affect people's ability to appear at public hearings and to protest, and it will also affect the accessibility of assessment documents for those whose internet facilities are limited and can't get down to the local library anymore to look at an EIS, for example. In terms of the Commonwealth changes, I think the practical impact will be more efficient decision making. The changes shouldn't really affect assessments and community engagement because they relate to processes to do with decision making and not to do with assessment. So effectively, the assessment status quo from the Commonwealth's perspective will be much the same. The issue will be whether or not the Commonwealth has that override power in terms of approvals. So not so much directly related to community engagement. But I think if the scheme that Professor Samuel's proposing involving these national environmental standards is implemented, we actually might see stronger community engagement in state assessment processes where EPBC Act approvals are required, because they'll have to comply with national environmental standards, and there is actually a standard proposed for community engagement. So we might in fact see, through these EPBC Act changes, more robust community engagement requirements for nationally significant projects. So what does this mean for how communities might engage with the planning process? Well, again, I think the limits on public participation at the moment often stem from the public health orders and public sentiment, more so than the planning changes themselves. I've already mentioned some of the practical changes for community engagement, such as less capacity and desire to attend public hearings and so on. And in some cases, difficulty in accessing documents. But if I can illustrate perhaps about the real sources of changes, by looking at information sessions and face-to-face engagement. Measures like these will be programmed into any reasonable community engagement strategy for a large-scale project these days. That's to be expected, really. The planning changes described earlier, and which Kirsty took us through, don't necessarily affect these sorts of events, but they become more difficult to hold because of the restrictions in health orders and people's reluctance to engage. I know in some cases, and I'm sure many of people listening and watching today will have as their own experience, people are less interested in engaging face-to-face at the moment because of concerns about the pandemic. And that's quite apart from any government policy or legal changes. So I think we've got to consider how we respond to all of this. And I think really we need to become more innovative in the way in which we engage. So everybody tuning into this webinar will have changed the way they communicate during the pandemic, no doubt. In fact, if it wasn't for COVID, this webinar would probably be in a conference room in Sydney or Canberra. Instead, we're presenting via video conference. And that actually highlights for me a potential advantage of this alternative form of communication, because if we were limited to a specific physical venue, many of you tuning in now wouldn't be able to attend the event. It's the fact that we're able to broadcast via webinar that enables people from around the country to attend. Now, to pick another example in New South Wales, I'm aware that the Independent Planning Commission in New South Wales, or the IPC, which makes decisions on large-scale public and private projects in this state, is continuing to hold large community engagement events for those major projects, but is doing so via video conference instead of community halls. Now, that can make community participation more difficult in an active way, but it can make viewing of those events and I guess access to information a bit more accessible because people don't have to go along to a community hall to be involved and to hear and see what's going on. So I think proponents and regulators and communities need to be more creative in finding effective ways for proper community engagement and also for impact mitigation in a COVID-constrained world. So I think that starts with raising awareness about the consequences of the COVID constraints for community engagement. And then that will trigger, I guess, a desire to look for more innovative measures. And I think that's actually why forums like this one are so important, because we're raising awareness about the potential pitfalls of this pandemic and alerting people to the need to do something about it. I might just finish with a few words about the social licence. I think, Sara, you've already mentioned my interest there, and I know it's important for more and more people these days. Now, as a good lawyer, or trying to be a good lawyer, I think I need to start with a definition of what a social licence is. So, to my mind, a social licence is not a formal approval, of course. It's not something that you get from a regulator, not directly anyway. I'd sort of describe it as more a recognition of community and regulatory authority acceptance. And I think there's kind of two kinds of or levels of social licence. There's a project social licence and then there's a corporate social licence. So for example, you could have a corporation which proposes a particular project and that project may not be successful in achieving community acceptance, but still the corporation has a level of community acceptance because of its general practices. Of course, if its projects stop getting acceptance in a social licence, that's going to damage the corporate social licence as well. That's really the distinction. Now, I think it's important to recognise that a social licence doesn't mean support for a project or for a company. And we have to accept that support is often unattainable for some projects. So acceptance, I think, is a more appropriate word. And that really involves, for me, a degree of understanding and perhaps an element of trust in the project or in the company. I suspect that the pandemic will cause some adjustment in what it takes to gain a social licence. My sense is that most people appreciate that things are different in the pandemic and that there must be a real focus on keeping the economy going. And that in some cases that will benefit not only society more broadly, but also the communities in which the project's being carried out, particularly if we think about regional communities, for example. So there are some benefits, I guess, which have heightened need at the moment. And so there's more of a balancing exercise. And I think evaluating the social licence probably involves a bit more compromise and forbearance from everybody. But I do think that the social licence will start to evaporate where communities feel like they're being taken for granted or they're being taken advantage of in terms of the engagement by project proponents, or indeed in terms of project design or mitigation measures to protect their well-being in times like this pandemic. Now, maybe not so much the fact that engagement's different or even more limited, or that short-term impacts are greater, for example, longer construction hours, but more that people might feel like the pandemic's being used to cut corners in engagement or project design or impact mitigation. That's going to be the tipping point, I think, for a social licence. So again, proponents, regulators and communities need to be more creative in finding effective ways for proper community engagement and mitigation in our COVID-constrained world. And I suspect that if communities can see genuine efforts to engage meaningfully, to design projects with communities in mind and to mitigate project impacts, then I think the social licence is still available. So I might leave my introductory comments there. Happy to answer questions as they come up, and I'll hand back to you now, Sara.
Nick, thank you so much food for thought there. The importance of the reforms and the changes that are happening, but also an acknowledgement that this is a really complex situation where many of these changes were in train prior to the pandemic, and now thinking about how this unprecedented situation is affecting and influencing not only the reforms themselves, but also the ways in which we engage communities around the reforms. And indeed, in your last comments about social license to operate, the ways in which communities may interpret the intentions of those reforms. And we will get to a discussion later about fast tracking, because we are hearing a lot about fast tracking and streamlining, and that does tend to be something that raises alarm bells for community members. So I want to turn now to Kylie Cochrane. And Kylie, I'm sure that you've got heaps to say about this, and I'd love to hear your perspectives on what you think is really driving these reforms and their practical implications in this really strange environment in which we find ourselves, particularly as it relates to public participation. Kylie Cochrane.
Thanks, Sarah. I was actually just sitting here going tick, tick, tick at everything Nick was saying. I think the key for me with these reforms, when I started to hear many of them, I was getting quite concerned, particularly when I heard about, New South Wales projects were going to be fast-tracked and potentially no consultation. And I was like, oh, wow, this is going to change our communities, change our relationship between communities and governments and project owners in a way that I don't think is positive. But what I have actually seen in reality is what is being fast-tracked is actually the bureaucratic approval part of the process rather than the consultation itself. And what's really fascinating is the government, all governments, federal and state, are still relying on that initial trust that they've had from the community. So in Australia, the community in the last 10 years has traditionally been or become more and more cynical about government. And there's many reasons for that, and I can go into that. But interestingly, in a time of crisis, Australians become very obedient, and for the most part, and when the government is issuing, different things about, you must stay indoors, there's curfews, you can't go here, you can't go there, you can't meet even in your home with more than X amount of people. We pretty much, for the most part, most of us did what we were told and did what we needed to do and trusted that government had our health and our well-being in mind whilst they were making those decisions. What's interesting now is we're starting to see the cynicism creep in. When you see memes come out of Victoria that compare Dan Andrews with Dan Murphy's and going, who is the better Dan during COVID? When you see things like that, you start to see, okay, the community is now going back to their place of cynicism about governments and politics in general. And so a lot of the reforms that have yet to come through or yet to really be implemented in a big way, I think we're going to see a lot more objection to those. I mean, interestingly, some of the things we see in New South Wales, not only have there been changes to planning processes, existing construction projects have been allowed to work up to 7 days a week, including Sundays and public holidays, which up until now, no politician has had the political will to say construction can happen on those days. We've seen in Victoria, I think Kirsty also mentioned, in Victoria, because there are fewer construction workers on construction sites, we're now talking about the project deadlines or project timeframes being extended quite substantially because it takes longer to do the work that they thought they were going to do, which means a longer impact or a more profound impact on surrounding communities. So I think we are going to see communities starting to object to that, and communities saying, I was comfortable with different restrictions and different regulations and different things being fast-tracked for that period of, for a certain period of time. But now that, and I don't know where the now is, I suspect it'll be in the next couple of months, but now we've reached our new normal, whatever new normal looks like. I want to go back to having the rights that I thought I had, and to live in the community that I choose to live in, and to be not be impacted in the same way for the greater good. And I think that's going to change, I've got to say, across cities and regions. I think in much of regional Australia, where we've seen the impact of, I mean, geez, look, in only the last 12 months, where we've seen the impact of floods, droughts, dust storms, what else were there, fires, and now the pandemic as well. And in some parts of regional Australia, there's also been through winter, the snowstorms. So we've seen the impact of that, and the impact that it has on regional communities, and the impact that it has on jobs. And I know that many of us in the cities sit here saying, yes, it has had a big impact on jobs and on people. But it's talking to my friends and family in regional communities where they really see that impact. I'm not saying we don't see the impact in cities, we absolutely do. But everybody seems to be impacted in regional communities in one way or another. That 7 steps of distancing that we seem to have is considerably short. It's almost like 1 or 2 steps of distancing that we need to have, that we have in regional communities. So many people have been impacted. And I've got to say, the response to fast tracking of projects in regional communities on the fast tracking projects that I'm personally working on is greeted. Of course, people want to know what's happening with the detail, but for the most part, regional communities are really comfortable with projects being fast tracked, because it's going to make the difference between water or no water. It's going to make the difference between a prosperous and economic town with jobs versus no town where the people all leave because they've got to go to the cities to actually get the jobs and live and put food on the table. So it's been an interesting response to date, and I think governments need to be really careful over the next couple of months as we enter the new normal, as their social license, to use Nick's terminology, their social license will go back to revert to what it was. And what it was is for the most part a place of cynicism and a place of distrust, that there is a distinct lack of trust that Australians, and we're not alone, but a distinct lack of trust that Australians have in our politicians and political processes. I'd like to make one other point too. Agreeing with Nick, I think where we have seen more impact in the last 6 months of COVID on consultation and engagement is more around social distancing. For those of us who like to protest in a march style, many people haven't been able to do that, or those that have tried have been arrested for social distancing, for compromising social distancing rules and regulations. It means that it has meant that face-to-face engagement, which most of us prefer as we engage in many, many different ways, but most people prefer to engage face-to-face with others. Particularly when it's about fairly contentious projects. There's something about looking someone in the eye and saying, tell me exactly what's going to happen to my property or my town or my street. But those kind of ways of engaging with people have been taken from us. Now we know it's temporary. We don't know how long temporary is, but we know it's temporary. And Zoom is fabulous in many ways. Being able to still connect is great. Being able to connect from our own lounge room or study, as I'm in, is really powerful and a great way of being able to reach people who traditionally are hard to reach. So they might be people with access issues, they might be people who live geographically too far from the location of where the community information session might be, they may be people with caring responsibilities, they just don't have the time. It's also a great way of ensuring that all voices are being heard, or more voices are being heard. One of the biggest issues that our industry has with community information sessions, and the main reason why we've moved away from town hall meetings is because it is the loudest voice that gets heard, or that crowd behaviour that gets amplified. And so if somebody has a dissenting view or even a different view, they don't necessarily get heard in that crowd. So one of the things that we are, sorry, I'm jumping around everywhere, but one of the things that we're seeing that is positive out of COVID in terms of engagement is that online engagement, I believe, will be used in conjunction with face-to-face, but online engagement will continue to be used in a big way post-COVID.
Thanks so much, Kylie. It's always wonderful to hear from you, particularly because your jumping around is most other people's extremely articulate. So we really appreciate your ideas and picking up on so many of the notions that Nick presented, mentioning social license to operate. And also, I think this really important calling out of the decline in trust and the cynicism that exists. And one of the things that we've been looking at in our own research and writing on the pandemic is this notion of compassion fatigue. And that's just where communities are being asked to do so many things so frequently now, and things that are really genuinely difficult, that we do all have a kind of reserve of resilience. And when you get to a certain point, it can be difficult to continue. And so I think there's some questions here around how much will be too much for communities, particularly as we're interested here today in the infrastructure space. How much pressure is too much pressure? How much fast tracking is too much fast tracking? How much streamlining is too much streamlining? And so, Nick, I'd like to ask you your opinion on this. In the research that we've done over the years, we've estimated that about $30 billion of Australian infrastructure investment has been lost due to stakeholder pressure and community opposition, particularly in relation to initiating new projects under these reforms. What do you think is going to happen where communities do feel that they've perhaps been sidelined because of fast tracking or streamlining? And what are they going to do when, they may not have the legal option when we enter that social license space? Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Look, I guess there's a wide range of activities which communities who aren't happy with a particular project or a particular proponent and feel motivated to do something about it can actually do. I think it's important to keep in mind there's got to be two elements here. One, they've got to be dissatisfied, and two, they've got to be motivated to do something. I think in Australia, as has come through in some of the comments already, we don't necessarily have the same level of motivation as societies in other parts of the world. There are people who are active and who engage in making their voices heard, but there's a lot of people who, I guess, are a bit more relaxed about things for whatever reason and aren't motivated to take a stand. So we need to have both elements there, and I think the motivation could be increased by the increased frustration of COVID, but also could be decreased as people start feeling a sense of helplessness or fatigue. So it's important to keep that in mind, I think. But look, thinking about the two issues and then moving on to what sort of avenues are available, I just started to break down, as we were talking, a few different categories. Maybe if we start with legal avenues. So New South Wales planning law allows any person, quote unquote, to bring a court proceeding to challenge the lawfulness of a project approval or to enforce the project's compliance with the law, such as approval conditions. This doesn't usually allow a challenge to the merits of the approval. So you can't say, well, I don't like the way it was decided. But it does allow a challenge to whether the approval was granted lawfully. And that includes things like taking into account all relevant issues properly, and also practicing what we call procedural fairness, which is a sort of a hallmark of proper community engagement. So legal challenges to the approvals in New South Wales are a real risk, which project proponents look to manage. And one of my jobs when helping people on a major project is to work out where legal challenge risk might arise and think of ways in which we can manage it. So that's a very real way, I guess, in which communities can keep project proponents a little more honest, and certainly focus their minds, if they're not already motivated, to do so. And I should add as a footnote there, a lot of project proponents are leading the way. In fact, they're asking government to up the ante in terms of project consultation requirements, because they're keen to engage with the community. They value that social licence. But for those who don't, there's the legal avenue sort of sitting behind there. Now, look, there's been no suggestion that the state government in New South Wales would limit these very broad legal challenge rights. That hasn't come up at all, really, during the pandemic. The federal government, on the other hand, has suggested in recent years that rights under the EPBC Act could be limited. They've expressed some concern about, I guess, what they call lawfare, or sort of legal challenges to approvals. But the Samuel Review has suggested only a refinement of those, really with a view to limiting cases based on purely technical issues, but still allowing legal challenges where the outcome is important. So legally, I think there will be avenues for people to take. Just quickly on a couple of other options, there's obviously political avenues. We shouldn't underestimate the power of submissions to a local member. We see a lot of government policy being influenced by the views of local members, and that in turn is influenced by what people say to them. So that can happen whether or not there's a pandemic. The form in which it happens might be a bit different, but certainly people could reach out to their local MP. There are social and economic avenues, of course, so campaigns against proponents, perhaps in the retail context. There's lots of examples of those over the years, where there's a social licence under threat. And I think those might be a little less effective during the pandemic, but again, social media is a pretty powerful tool for getting messages across. And then I guess there's project-specific impact, and here I'm really talking about the influence of regulators. So it's important to keep in mind, I think, that regulators are very responsive to community sentiment. That's the way they operate. So if a project's struggling with its social licence, for example, for some of the reasons I mentioned before, a regulator could become more demanding of a proponent, or take longer to process requests for approvals, even approvals for plans under approval conditions, for example, so during the operation of a project. And it might also give a proponent a harder time with any potential non-compliances along the way. I've seen a broad spectrum of regulator responses to proponents depending on the relationship those proponents have with their local communities. So I think all of these things can add up to significant additional time and cost for projects, and really reinforce the value in a practical sense of good community engagement. So it gives you a bit of a flavour for the sorts of things available. And I think, as I said, a lot of those are still available during the pandemic.
Thanks, Nick. I think that's really comforting to some to hear that the reforms are not intending to reduce the capacity for legal response, and also, the acknowledgement that there are a number of ways, including political submissions and protests, where communities can continue to voice their feelings about these issues. We have some really great questions coming in the Q&A chat box, and we invite all of you in the room with us to use that chat box to ask some questions. I want to throw this one first to Kylie Cochrane and then to Kirsty O'Connell. It really follows on from Nick's comments about communities still being able to participate, but the question in this current environment becomes, who's most likely to be left behind with when we have to shift to technology for these types of consultation, and whose voices are those that are most likely to be left out? And on a positive note, what are some of the ways that we can make sure that people who maybe aren't as technology savvy or technology comfortable can be included in community consultation? So I'd like to throw to you first, Kylie, and then we'll get Kirsty to come in on this one.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question. And this is something we've been grappling with in my own team. As we move to mostly online engagement, how do we ensure that the work we do remains inclusive, particularly when face-to-face options are out? So we've spent a lot of time going back to what I call old school traditional methods of engagement, a lot more resource intensive, but also quite rewarding in terms of the depth of conversation and feedback that you get. So a lot of phone calls, a lot of phone trees. For those of you who are around my age, you probably remember the phone tree. This was before social media. This is where I would ring 10 people, and Sara would be one of those and she'd ring another 10, and Kirsty would be one of those and she'd ring another 10, and so on and so forth. And through that series of 10 plus phone calls, you can then reach hundreds, at times thousands of people with news relatively quickly. Not as quickly as social media, but we do manage to get out there. So we were using that concept, we've used that concept of what I call the social phone tree, or the pyramid phone tree. And we have really sat down and thought about, particularly on our regional projects, who are the influencers in these communities and how can we tap into them and their networks? So we get on the phone, introduce ourselves if we don't already have that relationship, have a chat with them about the project, what we're trying to do, and then we say, look, you are really well connected in your community. How do you feel about sharing the information? Or if you're not comfortable about sharing the information, how do you feel about sharing your network with us so that we can share that information? So that's one way of doing it. We do hold on some projects COVID appropriate, very small group meetings. So in New South Wales, you're allowed to have up to 10 people as long as you're socially distanced in the right space. There's COVID, we call them COVID police people, but COVID regulators are there to make sure everyone's doing what they do, you know, as long as you have the mask, the hand wash, etc. You can still have those face-to-face conversations. We've done a lot of, you know, as some of you might groan, we've done a lot of door knocking because you can stand outside in someone's front yard or on someone's front veranda and have a conversation with them and still get that connection. So the key is really thinking about who you're trying to target, who is available, who is more open to in those kind of groups that you're trying to target, who's more open to online and who are likely to use that, and who are more open or more interested in other ways of engaging, and how can you do that in this environment? You know, another good one is the old kitchen table meeting. I did that on WestConnex. I brought that back in and it was quite amusing. Some of the younger people in WestConnex didn't know what I meant when I said kitchen table meeting. I think basically, Sara, I'm bringing back all my old activist techniques from the 70s and 80s around how we actually shared information and how we got information out to people, and using that for an engagement perspective, and just looking at, you know, what is old is new again, and combining that, of course, with online for those who can do the online. And so it's always a balance between lots of different options so that you can capture people's different circumstances and different engagement needs and abilities. One of the things we're also looking at, which has been really useful for some of our older and less tech savvy people in some of the communities we're working with, is we have Zoom instructions, if you like. And so we say, you know, here's how you register for the Zoom webinar, but here's a bit of an instruction if you'd like to read the instructions, and here's our 1-800 number if you need to have a personal little 5-minute lesson on how to Zoom, and we're really happy to do that with you. And that offer has been taken up a number of times, I've got to say. So more resource intensive, but we are getting out to the communities using, as I said, the traditional methods, or what is old is new again, which is kind of cool.
Thanks so much, Kylie. I totally agree. That took me right back to my primary school in rural North Carolina, where my mom would stand in our kitchen on the rotary telephone doing the Parent-Teacher Association phone tree. So I appreciate that. Yes, for those of you younger audience members joining us today, there was a world in which there was no internet. talk to us about it sometime. So we've had some really good comments coming through on the chats. Jacinta Cubis has noted about kitchen tables and shifting those onto Zoom. And it may actually be helpful if I share something from my teaching, because as a professor at ANU, all of our teaching now has to go online. And so our students, who are all ages, are also having to shift to communicating in new ways and using these technologies. And one of the things that we've been doing, which as Kylie notes is resource intensive, but we've actually been making really short videos with a free program, Screencast-O-Matic, which show people how to use the technologies. And so they can just watch a 3-minute video and have a really good introduction to these technologies. Kirsty, you had some ideas as well, so let's bring you back in, and then we've got some really terrific questions, and please do keep those Q&As coming in because we are monitoring the chat box.
We certainly are. I was just laughing, Kylie, because you're not the only one that's an amateur activist. I think there's one inside every community engagement person. We like to put the tools to work. I love that concept of the phone tree, and I was looking at Gemma's question around tips for engaging with cold groups during COVID. From my own experience on Parramatta Light Rail, which was a very linguistically diverse community, I think those kind of techniques where you're actually harnessing a local trusted person who's able to reach out within their own communities, and that same concept could be applied to regional communities who have a really tough time when you're dealing with technological consultation mediums, or really any community you'd like to sort of dissect. If you can actually reach out to those influencers and have them act as trusted brokers, honest brokers of information within their community, then I think that can be a really helpful tool. Another great technique that I did hear about, and which I plan to steal as soon as possible, was the idea of actually taking local experienced leaders and establishing a knowledge panel, for want of a better term, or an expert panel on whatever material issue you're dealing with, and having those people actually directly advising the project in that planning and development phase, when you do have the ability to influence the project and to really deal with those issues of access and equity that you might be experiencing with a linguistically diverse group. So fantastic stuff. Keep it coming, guys.
Kirsty, can I just pick up there, because Richard Parsons has asked in the chat box, Richard's with the New South Wales government, any tips or advice, not just for cold communities, but for engaging Indigenous communities, particularly during this time?
Look, I think that same philosophy flows through. If you're working with trusted, respected local members of any community, be it an Aboriginal community, be it a linguistically diverse community, be it, you know, a special interest group of any kind, then you're starting with a position of trust, and you're also getting really good expert advice on who the members of that community are and how you can reach them best. And some of my favourite pieces of work actually have been in the mining sector, where people have talked about the process to engage and how to best fit the engagement process to the needs of a given community. So I think that same philosophy could be applied there, Richard, and great question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kirsty. We've also got a really terrific question from Nicola Wass at RPS. Hello, RPS. We love having your team on the program. I feel like I'm a game show host now. Nicola says, we know before COVID that community stress and anxiety was already increasing, and there has been a lot of consultation fatigue in Sydney in particular, and Kylie certainly can speak to this. The stress from COVID is significant, Nicola writes, especially in Victoria, and right now I can tell you from Melbourne, it's a bit high. The ambient levels of stress will affect how people perceive projects, and this will increase the chance that people may perceive projects as an attack. And one of the things that Kirsty and I have been writing about in our recent work is the shift of suburbia becoming the new CBD. And one of the predictions that we've made is that it may be that projects which in the past, maintenance projects, relatively low level projects, which wouldn't have drawn the ire of community members, may now be much more impactful, and indeed community members may feel, as Nicole writes, potentially attacked or at least more annoyed by those projects, especially where they aren't able to separate their work from their home life. So Kylie, would you, Nicholas asked specifically if you could comment here on how you think practitioners, and I love this term, it's so important in our work, how practitioners can respond to this situation compassionately.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question. And I should start by apologizing for the snoring dog behind me. She's getting a bit noisy. So if you're wondering what that noise is, it's my coworker. So I think, first of all, practitioners, it would help practitioners to really understand where this underlying stress is coming from, because I believe it's significantly more than COVID. I believe that COVID has heightened the stress, but that stress has been there for really most of the last decade. And to me, that actually comes from, I talked earlier about communities no longer have trust in government. It's not only government and political processes that they don't have trust in, it's also many of the great institutions that used to make up society. So I have a theory called the social triangle theory. And for those of you who like to participate in webinars, by all means, get out a pen and paper, because you can do this with us. But if you draw a triangle, and for engineers on the call, make it an equilateral triangle, that's fine. And put on one point of the triangle the letter P, put on another point of the triangle the letter R, and put on the third point of the triangle the letter C. So you go back, and if anyone knows of a society or a tribe that doesn't fit this, I'd love to hear it, because in the couple of years I've researched this, I've yet to find a community, a country, or a tribe, first world, second world, third world, that do not fit or did not fit this, what made up their tribe or their society. And it was a mix of politics or political leaders or tribal leaders. So that's what the P stands for. The R is the religious institutions or the spiritual circumference that sits around the society or the tribe. And C is community, but very much defined in terms of people in place. And that used to make up our society, the fabric of our society. Whereas now, or over the last decade, we've seen a total distrust in politicians and political processes. So for those of you who are drawing this with us, put a big cross through the letter P. We've also seen, particularly the last 5 years in many countries all over the world, a substantial distrust and a feeling of betrayal that people have for religious institutions. What's interesting is they're not walking away from religion necessarily, but they're walking away from the religious institution. That's the topic of many other webinars, but for now, put a big cross through the letter R. So what we have left is community, but very much defined in terms of people in place. And what I mean by that is my family, my friends, my tribe, my mob, my iwi, for the Kiwis amongst us, and my street, my suburb, my land. That's all I have left that makes up what I believe is community or society. And so anything that threatens that, I'm going to react. I'm not going to trust it. I'm not going to believe it. I'm not going to trust the proponents of it. And I'm going to see it as a threat. And this is why I believe we've seen such intensive outrage towards just about every infrastructure project. It really doesn't matter shape or size. It could be anything from significant infrastructure through to maintenance. But because it is impacting people's sense of who they are and where they live, it's seen as a threat. So that's what I believe is the underlying tension or stress that we've had and lived with, very much so over the last decade. And to me, COVID has magnified that stress and that anxiety. Because again, we are worried about who we are and our people and our friends and family around us, and what's happening in our little microcosm from a geographic point of view. And what's fascinating is seeing, I agree with you, Sarah, I can see people's worlds coming down to the 5-10 kilometers circumference around where they live. And so we are even more stressed and strained and anxious about the impact on that little 5-10 kilometer little patch of the world. And that anxiety is no longer just infrastructure projects. It's also this weird, strange pandemic that, you know, nobody is completely sure of how the transmission occurs, and we're trying to do as much as we can to stop it from happening. And so from a practitioner perspective, I think it's really important to understand that the people we will be talking to and trying to engage with are in this place of anxiety, and that has sat with them for quite some time. It's sat with all of us. As practitioners, we also have that place of anxiety, and we need to recognize and understand that in ourselves. And I use the word empathy a lot in my practice. And I think it's, you know, for the engineers I work with, they kind of roll their eyes and go, empathy, yeah, soft skills. I go, no, this is actually the really hard stuff. This is the stuff that we've really got to get right. We've got to be able to walk in their shoes. We've got to be able to understand their experience to really engage and interact with them in a way that's meaningful for both practitioners and for the communities that we're engaging with. And we really need to genuinely take into account and believe that their lived experience is just as important as the technical experience of our engineers and architects and those that play more of a role in designing the big infrastructure projects. And that's where I see the point of tension occurring. And as practitioners, you know, we talked earlier about activists. I believe many practitioners have been activists in the past and may still continue to be activists. I believe those of us who have had that history, or at least those of us who have dealt with many activists and so understand that passion, I believe that our understanding there can help bridge, create that bridge, build that bridge between communities that are coming from that place of anxiety and tension, and being able to cut through that as best we can, acknowledging that we won't always do that every time, and that's okay, but as best we can to ensure that those views and that concern informs the infrastructure projects that we're trying to design and construct. Some of you might say, Kylie, you're living in a Pollyanna world, but I believe that it's the only way that we can get through the next decade post-COVID in a way where we're not going to see substantial community outrage delaying and stopping projects. I'm going to
Kylie,
get off my
thank you.
soapbox now.
I just want to say thank you for such a compassionate and empathic and passionate response to a really important question. So thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left. So if you do have any last minute questions or comments, that Q&A box is there. But what I would like to do in that 3 minutes is ask a question which I think relates to the stresses and anxieties that have been part of the discussion today. And that's the socioeconomic situation in Australia. Australia has officially entered recession, and we know that infrastructure projects are being tipped as one of the main ways to support and even speed economic recovery. So to both panelists, and we'll start with Nick, your quick response to this question: do the reforms that we have discussed today fit the bill? Are they going to give us what we need in terms of delivering that economic stimulus, that hope from infrastructure? Nick Thomas.
Thanks, Sarah. Look, I'll be very quick on this one because I know we're running short on time. I think they've had a significantly positive impact in terms of project facilitation, which is good to see. I think we're still trying to work out for ourselves as a community and as an economy, if you like, whether they've had enough of an impact and whether more can be done. But as I said in a lot of my previous comments, I don't think the changes themselves are necessarily the driving force behind some of the limitations on community engagement. So I think what we need to do in terms of bringing communities along with us and supporting them is to look at innovative ways to engage with communities. We've heard some fantastic ideas today, but I think we need to expand on those, to coalesce them so that we see them more consistently in projects across the board. And I think government's got a role to play there as well, in addition to the project facilitation work that it's doing.
Thanks so much, Nick. Kylie Cochrane, the last 30 seconds. Do these reforms fit the bill?
My short answer is yes and no. Yes, in terms of I can see the jobs will come out of it, the economic boost, sustaining communities, particularly regional communities. My caveat is that it must be in the context of inclusive and empathetic engagement for it to work.
Kylie, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to close out to our industry director, Kirsty O'Connell. It has been an absolute pleasure. Kirsty, close us out.
Thanks so much, guys. Look, what a fabulous way for us to have been able to start this industry webinar series. We will be looking forward to bringing you more on this. We're aiming for at least one very topical conversation per month. And certainly if you have ideas, if you've got questions that you'd like answered, topics you'd like explored, certainly shoot those ideas through. Thank you so much, Kylie and Nick, for bringing your expertise today. It's fantastic to have people who are so experienced and really able to grapple with the questions that we have. We have recorded the session today, so we look forward to posting that on our blog, and also to bringing you a much more detailed article outlining the latest changes and the implications in terms of how we can engage. So we look forward to your comments on that. So thank you everyone very much. If you do have any further questions that you'd like to explore, feel free to shoot those through, and we'll do our best to have those questions answered and to send that out in the post-event wrap-up. But that's about it from me. Thank you.